Hello everybody, hi, nice to see you all and welcome to the second in our series of 4 webinars looking at the aspect of dishonest employees in the workplace. And in the next half an hour we're going to have a look at the risk to your business with regards to dishonest employees in the workplace. We've got lots and lots of new people that weren't at the previous one, and we've got people that were on for the previous seminar that are here as well, so that's great. And in some of the slides, for those of you that were here for the first one, I'm just going to recap on some of those, but only briefly. And for those of you that weren't at the previous one, we can send you the recording of that as well, so that you're up to speed with the whole series. So by way of introduction, my name's Dave Kearns. I'm Managing Director of a company called Expert Investigations. We're a commercial detective investigation agency, and we deal with all aspects of dishonesty within the workplace. I'm one of the country's leading commentators on dealing with dishonest employees in the workplace. That is looking at preventing and disrupting them as well as detecting them. So hopefully you will find something useful from the seminar, the webinar, and please feel free to disseminate it to any colleagues that you do like. It is difficult, I know, to engender enthusiasm from a webinar as opposed to being face-to-face, but I can tell you that as of September onwards, I'm back doing face-to-face presentations and workshops. So if there's anything here of use that you feel that you want me to come in and speak to the business about, by all means do get in touch with me. So the risk to your business with regards to dishonest employees, we need to look and we need to be open-minded with regards to aspect of dishonesty in the workplace, and it falls into 2 categories, clearly the criminal side, which is pretty self-explanatory, and the civil side, and often the 2 actually do combine. And we're going to look at elements with regards to police involvement as well, and police will very, very reluctantly get involved with anything that they can push off as being civil. Now, we'll automatically always think of theft and fraud as being simple elements to reconcile as being dishonest within the workplace. So whether you're looking at things like procurement fraud, accounting fraud, theft of a product, a finished product, a part product, theft of money out of people's wallets or purses or lockers, we can equate to that really simply. But there's a lot more things that are behind that as well, a lot more other types of dishonesty in the workplace. You might have your bribery and corruption policies, but you will have employees that will breach those and they can commit offences under the Bribery and Corruption Act as well. Cybercrime now is on a massive upward spiral, upward climb. And there's lots of occasions whereby cyber attacks are actually instigated by internal individuals within organizations, and also cyber thefts and thefts of that data from individuals within organizations. You won't necessarily think of things like drugs and alcohol within the workplace, of that being an element of dishonesty. But I can tell you, over 21 years of investigating dishonest employees, we have seen people that have been manufacturing illegal drugs, Class A drugs. So we've seen people and we've caught people that have been making crack cocaine in the works canteen. One of the biggest cannabis crops that I ever saw was not actually in the police service. It was in a commercial environment where it was being grown wholesale. You've also got people that are selling drugs within the workplace as well, and coming into work under the influence of illegal drugs as well. Now, you also have subversive individuals in organizations as well as attacking organizations. And just this year, we've had 3 different businesses that have been subject to subversive individuals. And we've got one that's so live, we're working on it at this moment. And we've identified an employee that is posing as 4 different people in order to spread a hate campaign against his employer. We've recently had one with a college of further education, again with somebody that has been dishonest and is creating really bad PR for that organization on false and malicious accusations that are being made. You've then got harassment and discrimination in the workplace. Now, quite rightly now, people are feeling much more comfortable in coming out and talking about things that have happened within the workplace. And of course, the Me Too in America was a big catalyst for people to have the confidence to come out and say when there's been activity geared towards them, unwarranted activity towards them. which is absolutely wrong, and it may well fall into offences under the Sexual Offences Act, Harassment, Protection of Harassment Act. And we've now seen that it looks potentially as if there's going to be a lot of inquiries into the education system with the new website that has been put up there, and victims are coming forward and saying how, you know, they have been ill-treated by, in certain cases, there will be employees within the organisation. And I do actually personally think that there is going to be other organisations where people will feel more confident of coming out again and saying how they've been unjustly treated. And that could be people that have been going through training establishments in order to get promotion. So, you know, that there is a really serious element of dishonesty and dishonest individuals' behaviour in the organisation, as well as things like false absenteeism, people long-term sick from work. We're not looking at the duvet day, we're looking at long-term sick where it's having a financial impact upon a business, and it is a dishonesty of that employee that is costing the business time, it's costing them money, potentially it's costing them reputation with orders and things not being fulfilled, and getting log jams in a process. And then, as I mentioned at the start, we've got theft of data. Theft of your data as a business. Police are never going to be interested in this, very, very, very rarely. Well, that can have huge financial and reputational impacts on your business, and it's really easy for employees to be dishonest in this way, and it's actually one of the fastest growing crimes within the workplace. So I don't want you to stop now, just at this moment, and think, what effect would a dishonest employee have on your business? Reputationally, financially, morally, how does it make your work colleagues think? The effect of a dishonest employee on a business can be significantly more than potentially the first thing that you think of, and it can have really quite significant ramifications. But when I ask the question, how much dishonesty is there within a business? There are no records that you can go to that will definitively say, it's cost this amount to business this year, elements of dishonesty, whether that be theft, whether it be fraud, whether it be civil issues. There are no figures. Now, we're going to look at some figures later, but my view always has been that they are fundamentally flawed, because I've done a freedom of information request to the police services across the country, and they do not categorise crimes within the workplace specifically as crimes within the workplace. So a theft will just fall into a category of a theft. So it's very difficult to get any definitive figures. And again, how many businesses, including you out there, have had dishonesty in the workplace? You've dealt with it and you've never reported it into any formal system of reporting, for example, to your insurance company or to the police. It's very difficult to get a foothold as well, because we can only base figures really on the offenders that we find. So when we looked in the first webinar, there was a whole list there of recent cases this year of £76,000, £120,000, the one which we were involved with, £300,000. A lot of figures do not go into that pot. And I personally have dealt with one which was £12 million, and that figure never went anywhere other than within that business. It stayed within that business. It never went into the public domain. So it's very difficult to qualify how much and what the extent financially the cost is of dishonest employees within the workplace. Now, this is recapping on the last webinar as to why employees are dishonest, and this is called the theft and fraud triangle. It's actually originally it is the fraud triangle designed by an eminent criminologist in America called Don Tracy. I actually take it for pretty well all elements of employee dishonesty, and I've adapted it to that. So whether it be theft of data, whether it be theft, whether it be fraud, whether it be selling drugs in the workplace, manufacturing drugs, false absenteeism, it is always the fact that the employee has the opportunity, they rationalize their actions, and the motivation always is for financial remuneration, with the exception, obviously, of the harassment that I mentioned at the very beginning. There's generally no financial motivation for that, but it is opportunity, rationalization, and motivation. And employees do this around their normal working practice, around their normal working activity. And if you've seen some of the other presentations, this is something that I push quite an awful lot about how and why employees will be dishonest. So as I say, the previous webinar, if you look at the link there, that will explain that a little bit more. But as we go through, especially some of the case studies and some of the cases that I'm going to highlight, just continue to think of the opportunity, the rationalization and the motivation when these employees decide that they are going to be dishonest. So when we actually look at what figures are available, and again, I'm coming here from a fact of saying that whilst they might write in a certain amount of leeway for what has been missed, I think they are fundamentally flawed and wrong. But the NatWest has produced figures at the end of last year to show that £190 million of business fraud was affected against businesses last year. So that's all types of business fraud. 88 million is committed by employees. Now that is fraud. That is something that is defined as fraud. That's not even incorporating something such as theft. So if somebody has stolen product out of a business of £250,000 or £30,000, those figures are not equated onto there because this is looking purely at fraud. So even if you were looking at fraud, those figures are really quite astounding. 88 million committed by employees. Start to put theft on top of that, I reckon you can guarantee that you could double that. So the impact on businesses can be really quite significant. And as a key person within a business or an owner of a business, you have to be mature, realistic and responsible in accepting the fact that you will have dishonest employees, you have had dishonest employees, or you have got dishonest employees. And if we start at that point, then we can at least try and look at preventing and disrupting it, which we will cover off in webinar 3. Now, that figure there, even if we're just equating there on 88 million, that's double the previous year. How that's going to transpire next year will be interesting because, of course, we've got the COVID situation in between, which will obviously affect an awful lot of figures with all elements of fraud and dishonesty. And it will be interesting to see how that is going to pan out and see what the figures are. But data fraud increased by 25% on the previous year. That is theft of data. That is theft of your data. Possibly for a lot of companies, the most valuable piece of IP, the most valuable piece within the organization. I myself practice what I preach. To me, the most significantly precious thing to me is my data, my database. So I don't want my operations team seeing that. I don't want my finance team seeing that. And I mitigate against that to protect it. But you see consistently within news and media reels and outlets that data is absolutely king. And in the previous webinar, we did look at the employee from the fraud team of Santander Bank who had stolen so much data, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of data, and sold it to criminals for their use. Data really is, it's golden oil nowadays. Procurement fraud is the next most prolific, and that is all elements with regards to procurement fraud, irrespective of the size of a business and an organization. So as a business and an organization, you can't look and think because we're small, we're not going to be attacked by a dishonest employee. Because we're large, we've got systems in place that are going to protect us. The reality of that does not work, as the fraud triangle shows, with opportunity, rationalization and motivation. And then you've got personnel fraud, which is number 3 at the moment. Now, personnel fraud can be all sorts of things, but it's predominantly looking at ghost workers, CV fraud, and false sickness, false absenteeism. That's long-term sickness for a mental debilitation or a physical injury, where people have been off weeks or even months. They're on full pay, then half pay, they come back to work. Often you will find, and this is our experience in the investigation side, while they're off sick, they're working for somebody else, they've started their own business, they're working cash in hand, or they've stolen your data and they've used that data to set their own business up as well. And this is where a lot of elements of dishonest employees entwines, because it's never anything just as simple as going down that avenue and you will find the answers to A, B, and C. They do entwine. And the CV fraud actually may well be much harder to detect now as we here present and potentially going forward with the new working environment, because we're not going to have that face-to-face interaction when we are going to be interviewing people, when we are going to be trying to verify their credentials. This does put another risk onto businesses as well. And these figures here, as I say, are just looking at fraud. What about the other types of dishonesty within the organization when it comes to a financial impact? So what are the risks? You know, the obvious risks are financial loss, reputation, yeah. Do we always think about morale? And do we think of indirect financial costs and losses? So if somebody steals something from your organization, say, for example, it's a product, £250,000 worth of catalytic converters is one that we dealt with. That's a direct financial loss that those have gone. But there are also other financial costs in relation to that. That product has got to be remade. So the metal has got to be bought again. It has got to have the transport costs in. It's got the employment costs of remaking the product. It's got the utility cost of all of the electricity, the power, the lighting, the tools that you will use, the lubricants, the cutting tools. There is always a significant indirect financial cost. There is also the cost of your time and anybody else's time in dealing with an issue. And this, indeed, it could be legal fees that you are getting embroiled into something here, and the legal fees are going up and up and up, and other professional service fees as well. And then you've got a reputational aspect, that if something does come out into the public domain, and maybe a theft or a fraud in your organization will not really be reputationally hugely damaging, but actually if you're in a particular kind of business, that could be significantly more damaging, the reputational aspect, as opposed to the financial aspect. You think, for example, within the charity sector, there are an awful lot of theft and frauds. I'm going to give you a couple of cases in this one here, and that has huge impacts on people's perception of a business. Now, the perception, if we want to go right to the other end, if you look at the American film industry, that reputation has been permanently tarnished with the Me Too element as well. Now, if you get that happening in other businesses, even if it's in local businesses, or other aspects of dishonesty or fraud or bullying or drugs in the workplace, because that is always a great media story, that you're a business on an industrial estate geographically based in one area. It makes a huge story in the local newspaper. It then picks up and it gets traction. It has a big reputational impact. Now, reputations, as we all know, are really hard to win, but they can be lost very quickly and very easily. And when we look at the risks of dishonesty in the workplace, we have a duty of care to our employees. They have a right to dignity in the workplace, and they do not want to be associated with a stigma of an organization that is dishonest. And again, media stats and figures and reports show this as supporting this. I've worked in organizations where there's dishonesty, and sometimes you think, is the finger of suspicion being pointed at me? And it wrongly being pointed at me. If your organization has been lambasted through the press, do you actually want to be associated with an organization like that? So there is a moral impact on your workforce when there is dishonesty within the organization. So the reality with regards to a risk within an organization is, in the last 10 years, there has been a 16% decline in reporting dishonest employees for prosecution. Four main reasons are adverse PR. People do not want their dirty linen washed in public. The other thing as well is there is a lack of proof and a poor standard of proof. Now, I know that on the webinar, we've got lots of people that are investigators, professional investigators within organizations, and you, like I, have the training and the skills to be able to conduct a proper lawful investigation, to follow an investigative chain in order to deliver the evidence for somebody to make a considered, informed judgment on. 9 times out of 10 within organizations, this will fall to HR or finance or an operations manager that are brilliant at their jobs, but they are not necessarily skilled and trained in gathering, preserving and presenting the evidence. So therefore then, if you come to look internally, you might not have sufficient evidence to prove what you want to, even if you're looking purely at a civil burden of proof on the balance of probability as opposed to the criminal one of beyond reasonable doubt. But you may well then find that what encourages a lack of police appetite is the fact that the evidence that you have got is corrupted and tainted, or, and that, I mean that inadvertently, because of the way that you've conducted an investigation. The main one there is people getting IT to start looking at trying to do computer forensics without the right software, and it corrupts and taints that data that's potentially there. But the police are coming and looking and saying that, you know, there's no burden of proof, there's no standard of proof, people have been interviewed incorrectly, evidence has been contaminated, it has been lost. And that's no reflection on the individuals that have done the investigation. It's just the fact that they don't have those skills. But that gives the police a reasonable reason to say, we're not coming to investigate it. Now, I know a lot of you that are here will be looking and thinking, well, I've tried to report things to the police before and they're not interested. The reality is, as much as the government want to say that employee dishonesty is one of their Home Office goals and objectives, it's not. We have to accept that the police do not have the resources to investigate. And unless they come in and say, can you tell me who has committed the crime, who has committed the theft, the fraud, who has manufactured the drugs, they won't be interested because they haven't got the finite resources to send an investigation team in to conduct an investigation through a workforce of 30, 50, 100, 200 people. So it's left with you. The police have got, they've got more issues now to deal with and more crimes to deal with now than they did 21 years ago when I started the business. Terrorism wasn't terrorism what it is today. Modern day slavery didn't really exist in the format that it does now. Organized crime gangs that are committing cyber attacks and wholesale frauds against the country didn't exist like they do now. And the police have lost a lot of the skills in order to be able to investigate workplace-based crime. And we'll come on to that with an example shortly. And within business, you know, for you, the risk has gone, we'll move it on. We've lost money, we've taken a hit. We'll just move the problem on. We'll get rid of the individual. They will go from the organisation, and they will, you know, the CV, the references are fairly limited of what they say on an individual now, and the problem has gone from your business. And if they get employment elsewhere, it becomes somebody else's problem. And these are the 4 reasons that why there has been the decline in reporting for prosecution. And so the risk is still staying within your business of a dishonest employee, because a lot of people know that, for example, you know, people won't report something because of the PR, or the police aren't interested, they won't investigate it. Oh, if I do get caught, what am I going to get? A slap on the wrist and just sacked, and I'll go and get another job. And that has caused that decline, and that leaves a big risk within the business. And the smaller the business, the more vulnerable you are. Now, that doesn't mean that a large business is exempt and is more secure. It's just the fact that the smaller the business, the more vulnerable you are, because you don't necessarily have all of the mechanisms in place to prevent and disrupt employee dishonesty. You probably don't even have a budget for it. You know, you've got budget for general security, but you wouldn't have budget and time, resources, and somebody probably wouldn't have a responsibility for this subject. My view is, and I present this to boardrooms, is this ought to be on your boardroom agenda, and somebody ought to be designated with the responsibility. And it comes up at your boardroom meetings, and you've got a little checklist to work through there. SMEs lose almost double more per fraud. The average loss there, 150k with less than 100 employees, and 78k where there's more with more than 100 employees. But the more employees that are involved in the dishonesty, the longer it takes to detect it, and also the higher the financial loss on average. And also the more senior in the organization, the losses are significantly higher, and again, it becomes significantly harder to identify it and detect it, generally because people have got more responsibility the higher up that you go up that hierarchical chain. And if you consider that less than 1 in 5 SMEs have conducted a fraud risk assessment, well, even less than that are ever going to consider what's the risk to us for dishonest employees in our organisation, whether it be civil issues or whether it be criminal issues. A couple of case studies I'll just take you through now here. And Oxfam They're taking a bit of a battering because in 2015 they had their first scandal with use of sex workers by senior aid officials, and they are now back with a new complaint that has come that they believe has been going on since 2015, again with regards to exploitation of individuals. This is a huge, well-known, established charitable organisation, a huge business. But on their first case, when it hit the press, they had to make £16 million worth of cuts because of the lack of donations that came in. That is a huge, huge amount of money, especially for a business that is charitably funded. And it's the reputation there that has been completely tarnished. And that reputational loss and the financial loss has left Oxfam in a very difficult position in order to financially recoup those funds again by getting charitable donations and rebuilding their reputation. Bupa had an employee that stole data and tried to sell it. And the Information Commissioner's Office, this was luckily for them a few months pre-GDPR, fined them £175,000. Had it been a few months later, it would have been 17 million. Now, I'm sure you all know the aspect with GDPR and 4% of your turnover. They were lucky there. And that was an employee that stole that data and tried to sell it on the dark web. Now, Morrison's, they had the same with an employee, a disgruntled employee in the IT section that had lawful access to all of the financial data of their employees, and they tried to sell it on the dark web. The individual was arrested, and the ICO again fined Morrison's hugely, and then the employees were allowed to claim for compensation. Only recently, Morrison's have had that overturned in the European Court. But that has again been a huge reputational aspect on Morrison's. It's a huge morale issue for Morrison's with regards to their employees that feel that their data hasn't been looked after, and there's been this very open public court process. And the costs to Morrison's aren't going to be absolutely substantial, really significant, because they've had to pay out in the first place. They've gone through the whole process of having to fight the case through the courts with the legal fees, and how much time did that take with, I guess, pretty significant individuals within the organisation. Those indirect costs have suddenly mushroomed really quite significantly. And British Airways, whilst this is a cyber attack, never think that everything always is externally orientated, because you have got people that go into businesses in order to access information to assist outside criminals. In October, they were fined by the ICO for theft of data. It was on a cyber attack. £20 million they had to pay. They were meant to pay 170 million, but because of the state of the airline industry under COVID, that had been reduced to 20 million. So these are significant figures. Now, these are large organisations that I'm talking about here, but let's come down to one here called Operation Daniel. Daniel worked within a large organisation that supplied a workforce to companies around the country. He was a Philippine national. He had an aunt in the Philippines that had a business finding work for UK-based people. Daniel, in his role within the business, was exploiting these individuals. He was finding them legitimate work within the organisation. He was bringing them, or they were being brought over. He was arranging all of the travel fees and charging them extortionate costs. He was then housing them in properties that he had, which he had literally created beds in, where he packed them, racked them and stacked them, charging them exorbitant fees in order to be living there and for their food. We're looking here at, sort of kind of modern day slavery. He was involved with the recruitment company that the individuals were coming into the UK, seeking the positions within the business that he worked for, and he was taking backhanders from them. And this was all found by us conducting an investigation, and it was computer forensic examination and placing him under surveillance and taking statements from people. He left the country before the investigation was finished and went back to the Philippines. The impact, because this was dealt with internally, the impact on that business would have been staggering from a reputational perspective. They weren't losing so much from a financial perspective, but reputationally, if it ever had come out, then it would have been really, really quite significant. And Operation Evesham is one I mentioned before, with a lady called Wendy Dillingham, who stole £300,000 from her business in the accounts team. She ran the accounts team. This was a small business, 12 people. When it was discovered, Wendy Dillingham disappeared and went on the run. It took us 3 days to do the investigation. She had taken £300,000 out of a business that had a working capital of about £320,000. There were 12 people employed, and the managing director was having to use his own personal money over the next year or two to fund the business in order to keep it afloat and those 12 people keep their jobs. The interesting one with this case is it took us 3 days to investigate it. It took the police 6 months to come in and investigate it and for Wendy Dillingham to be arrested. Now, when she did go to court, she pleaded guilty and she was sentenced to 5 years in jail. The important thing here is the evidence had been gathered and been preserved. So even though we were looking at 6 months down the line before the police got involved, a number of reasons why they didn't get involved, the evidence was secured. And so therefore then, one element of a risk was mitigated against the business because they'd secured that evidence at the very least. And when they talk about things being victimless within the commercial world and victimless crimes, if you look at what we did in Operation Wales, this was the theft of £250,000 worth of catalytic converters. And it was as simple as some employees driving on site past the security guy who they just waved. They've got a transit van. One of the guys on the forklift truck just loaded the transit van up a couple of times and they just drove off with the catalytic converters because they had the opportunity, rationalised their actions, and they had the motivation. At the time, that business was making redundancies. It was making a third of its business, a third of its workforce on that site redundant. And you're looking here at a loss of £250,000 worth of products. Huge financial impact. Also, the secondary financial impact with all of the process that I mentioned earlier about, here we've got to remake the product. And the morale impact. You've got a business here that its employees are looking and thinking, when losing people, are being made redundant. And there was a lot of families that worked in this organisation. We're losing business and people are being made redundant, and yet the organisation can't protect the product. People can steal it. That has that morale impact on individuals within the workforce. So just as we come to conclude, my advice always is to look at a tiered approach. Educate your boardroom and senior management so they understand what the risks are to a business, to understand how to prevent and detect and disrupt. You yourself look at gap analysis and vulnerability testing and look at basic investigation and interview training. And in the third webinar, which is in 2 weeks' time, we are going to look at how to prevent and disrupt dishonest employees within the workplace. Now, I've got a couple of questions that I can see on the screen here, and I know we're 12:33. I will stay a little bit later afterwards in case anybody wants to pop a few more questions in. I've got one here from Steve. How do you prevent dishonest employees? I'll tell you in 2 weeks' time, Steve. So please log on to that. Emma, to what extent do I personally think there is dishonesty in the workplace? As I said, Emma, it's very difficult to say what the figures are. I look at my business and I look at the potential risks to it. And I like to think that I'm realistic, responsible and mature in how I look at where the risk is and mitigating that risk. So instead of it being here, it's down to about here. I go into businesses and I look with a view that people will be dishonest. And I'm going to one tomorrow down in London where we've worked before, and we're going to do a risk assessment there. I will actually enter into there thinking, if I was a dishonest employee, what would I take? How would I do it? And what procedures do they have in place? It's impossible to say, but we want to be trusting people, but not everybody who we employ and who we know and who we associate with are necessarily that trusting people. And Sarah Jane, how can we engage the police more to investigate theft and fraud? I think, as I've said, it's very difficult. They are under-resourced. They have a lack of skill within this area. They will look at it and say it's a victimless crime. You are a business. It is a civil issue. You deal with it internally. That puts big risk on you as a business. The risk is being put from a police fair and squarely back onto you. The difference is, if you've got the evidence, you can push them and push them and push them, and the evidence is there and secured, and it's much harder for them to refuse to take an investigation when it has all been done, especially if it's done in accordance with the sort of police rules and regulations and how they gather, preserve and present the evidence. So I hope that has been of use. Run slightly over. I would say please do connect on LinkedIn, because we put lots of information out there, and on Instagram and Facebook. I'm going to send you the recording of the webinar. Please do share it amongst any colleagues or any business groups and HR groups particularly that you are part of. Please don't ignore the risk, and don't think that it won't happen to you. And don't miss webinars 3 and 4, because on number 3, I'm going to show you how to prevent and detect it at a very minimal cost as well. And then on number 4, I'm going to show you how we do covert investigations and catch people that are dishonest within the workplace. So I hope that's been of use. I'm going to keep quiet now. If anybody wants to stay and email any other questions in, then by all means, please do. But other than that, have a great day, great weekend, and hope to see you soon. Okay, no more questions coming. Cheerio.